On Sunday, November the 17th, 2019, I posted this, which I call simply, in Roman numerals, 2930. There was a bit of an auspicious but clearly detectable mumble at one of the giant dining, at one end of the giant dining hall, in which a familiar discussion had begun to engross the men from the north and south sides of the border, a tradition that had begun years ago. The two traditions, one was the dinner they were now enjoying together, one of only 4 times a year, in which they officially mingled. These two factions, of course, they were not the first that inhabited the local land. And the other tradition was the subject with which they were now fully entertaining, with mostly respect and only a few loud voices coming from a smattering of red-faced fogies. The talk of a long-ago love affair, a suicide, a murder, or 3, another purported suicide that ended it all, or one would think, but perhaps it was just the story about the border between the two states, an old and very random wooden fence row, a property signifier, they still like to call it, by which I signify that this discussion captured the attention and engaged all of those at the table, those from north of the old fence and those who resided to the south of it. The fence was to become the basis for the official border between the Dakotas at the time. It was 1889. The party in this grand ballroom, the joke about in the middle of nowhere, was beginning to be grumbled, always got a bit rowdy at this point. The conversation was not exactly tradition. It was just something not to be forgotten, not by these men. And this was the one time it always was brought up. The Lindsays weren't really thinking about the crows that dropped to the fence every day about the same time, an ominous sense of foreboding, thought the Milners. Some had already reduced the name to Miller, but they were still always called the Milners at this time. But we're thinking more about the women and how it could not be escaped that those from one side of the fence had a certain homeliness. Some even used the word possessed look about them. On the other side were deemed the beauties. On this notion, both sides most often agreed. These were quintessentially male arguments, of course. The women were yet to be allowed at the function, except for the cooking and the cleaning, not to be heard or hardly seen, and now this gathering of men had moved on to the more jovial topic that always followed the grumbling about the randomness or the clear thievery of the fence row that became a border and would always round out the evening. They began to speak of the love story between the up-and-coming young man on one side of the fence who fell for a low lady, as they were often still called, from the opposite side. This was, of course, anathema to the tribesmen, but, as always, this nostalgic epic took over the conversation. The rowdiness became congeniality and literal awe for the lovers on both sides of the fence, and what became of their love, which was tragic. Although no one was present at the table that had actually known either party, it had become a bit of a legend, a sort of modern-day equivalent to the Capulets versus the Montagues in Romeo and Juliet. Excuse me. Even though none of these men likely knew a thing about Shakespeare, except perhaps that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. This part of the discussion carried inevitably on into the parlor that wrapped the giant old home that took up what must have been an acre of the dry surface, of what was normally a cracked earth template toppled with incessant and swiftly flowing tumbleweed during the months when the surface of the earth was not snow-covered. The youngest of the Lindsay men eventually managed manipulatively, but somewhat subtly, he did have a golden tongue, or so it was rumored, to veer the talk toward the story of the lady he called the frippery Gaul girl that he currently had more than just his eyes on. This particularly frontier's Romeo of the moment. This particular frontier's Romeo of the moment was this young Lindsay fellow. He made his way to the parlor first, which wrapped neat clean around the full front of the mansion, which is what everyone still called the old Dullmeyer place to this day, even though it now served as more of a traditional meeting hall, and yet, in this case, the word mansion was an appropriate description. A place which swore out most all frontier creatures small enough to sift through the windows, as well as those large or wily enough to break through the windows, or even the doors. The screens of both of which had been special made in Sweden, of the extraordinary, exquisitely stitched linen, like but vividly see-through tiny wires. One of the screen doors was closed, and there seemed no way out of it from the inside, and one always had to imagine had no easy way to enter from the other side, unless you were one of those fantastical creatures, microscopic. All of this created a sense of peace, for these third-generation settlers whose progenitors had originally been warring factions. It had begun with one outspoken family from a few miles east with a grudge against the long-standing family of Old World Money. The Money clan had already been living there longer than anyone knew by the time the tensions even arose. There was always much discussion about how and why this grudge began. Everything about this moneyed family was near ancient now, but there still remained the sweet and spoiled youngest heir, Julie. Yes, a name so representative of the many such quarterly roundtable discussions which transpired here at the old Dullmeyer mansion. The Dullmeyers had turned out being that old wealth family of local lore. I remember this poem, by the way. It's very weird to me, this poem, and long. But that story is for another time. This evening, around that grand table, in a place that seemed destined to retell a Shakespearean tragic love story 4 times a year, despite the general ignorance in these parts of that certain universal British playwright and poet. And so they did, well into the evening. Young Lindsay and his best mate, clearly meant by Lindsay to attend solely as a companion, to remain unnoticeable, finally, indeed rather unnoticeably, lit his pipe and began the ritualistic trek toward the door, a sort of double-file handshaking ceremony out of the mansion door and into the night, as was the tradition, with each man taking off toward his respective home, whether it stood on this side of the border fence or the other. As he was walking out, in fact, the young Lindsay's awe of this new woman, who he intended to make his wife, engulfed him into the realization that she was not so very frippery at all. She was so very near his age, which was an unheard of characteristic of the general courting which transpired in this area. And as he walked out into the moonlight, he suddenly realized how terribly he had mischaracterized his love, had indeed not even realized what it was about the young Miss Gaul that really caught his fancy. And this realization gave him a pleasant pause, not an uncomfortable nor a worrisome one, but quite simply, he opened his eyes to the fact he loved her. For she was remarkably full of intelligence. One might even say she was combustible with sage wisdom. Fancy that, he thought, as he left the camaraderie of the former foe's traditional gathering, and he began to take on a strikingly abnormal spring to his gait, thanks to an unusual lightness in his walk. The back of the soles of his makeshift shoes never seemingly making contact with the earth, never resting from tired ankles, as if a man on a very important mission. For the miles that he walked his way back home that night, looking ever so forward to seeing the handsome Miss Gaul at the earliest possible convenience. Yes, the absolute earliest possible time. he kept saying in his head, with a smile that brought on the most engaging dimples, which was a trait of the men from both sides of the wall that represented the border between the old warring factions of, as we all are, of course, related human beings. Do not remember that ending. I've written twice about this particular story, I think. And it's a story I just completely made up, in which the ending is not human at all. There's just dogs around a table. A dog, maybe. Very fascinating. Sorry, for me, very fascinating, strange, and intriguing, I think, story.